Chapter 29. A Metamorphosis. "David!" exclaimed Yakov as he pulled the door open. "Great to see you. I've got a roommate, all the way from Paris. This is Ari Thalberg. Ari, meet David Colley." Ari felt himself instantly and comprehensively scrutinized, analyzed, and memorized by the slightly balding, stocky man of medium height in his mid-forties who catapulted himself through the doorway and grasped his hand. "So you've moved to Israel?" It was more a statement than a question. Ari was immediately alert. Who was this man with the quick eyes and noncommittal expression, and what did he know? He decided to keep that question alive for future consideration. "Yes, just arrived a few hours ago. Yakov's good enough to share his flat with me." "This is the place to be, in the old city. Keep your eye on the old man, though," added David, tilting his head in Yakov's direction and winking at Ari. "He may need some help getting up and down the stairs." Yakov snorted. "David was one of my lieutenants in the '67 war. Couldn't keep up with me then, and he's still jealous. Works for the Defense Department. One of these days, I'm going to march in there and clean out some of the dead wood. It's not like it used to be." David grinned. "That's why I drop in once in a while, to be reminded about how superior the good old days were and to pick up some of Yakov's nuggets of wisdom. He has plenty to spare. We have some great discussions. You're welcome to sit in any time. Right now, if you wish." "Thanks. I'm still trying to digest all the erudition he's been pouring into me since the minute I arrived. Good to meet you. I'll look forward to seeing you some other time." Ari turned and headed down the hallway to his room. Closing the door behind him, Ari stretched out on the bed, feeling totally exhausted. Could it be that his age was catching up with him? Age? 46 wasn't so old. He'd get back to running, find a good gym, and get back in top shape. There might even be a karate studio where he could earn some extra money as a part-time instructor. He needed to enter some tournaments and beat some of the local competition, make a name for himself. Then the karate students would come flocking. It was hard to believe that he was actually here in Jerusalem, the very place he least wanted to be. At the moment, he was a ward of the Israeli government, with no job and a decent but apparently religious old Boer for a roommate. He was a stranger in a strange land, with nothing to look forward to or to live for. Committed to revolution all of his life, he was now an old warhorse put out to pasture. Could life ever have any purpose again? Still, the sharpness of the despair had lessened to a small degree. Should it, he wondered? Was he being untrue to Nicole in this first slight healing? Yet one could not go on living in the past. To continue to blame himself for her death could not help Nicole. She was gone, and it would only make his new start in Israel more difficult to bear if he kept looking back. But what about little Ari Paul? How he wished he had the picture Nicky had sent. Would Bourbonnais be true to his word? Would they really pack up his things and send them here? That picture, casually thrust between 2 volumes. Would it be lost, or packed up with the books and arrive safely? It was all he had. Of course, little Ari wouldn't look like that anymore. He'd been so tiny then. He'd be several weeks old now, and growing each day. Soon he would be learning to walk and talk and respond, all without his father there to share those moments. Who was raising him? Would he ever know who his father was? Would father and son ever meet? He owed it to Nicole to find Ari Paul and raise him in her memory. Ari fell asleep, wondering when and how he would be able to bring his son to Israel. As the child's father, he must have some rights. Surely he could take custody of his own offspring. He'd have to get a job first and establish himself here in his own apartment, or perhaps even a home out in the country where the child could grow up in fresh air, learn to ride horses. It was a dream worth dreaming, something he could do for Nicole. When Ari called the Jerusalem Post the following morning, he discovered that Uzi had already arranged an appointment for that afternoon with the editor-in-chief himself. The reception given him was beyond his expectations as a complete newcomer to the field of journalism. "Uzi told me you were the head of the political science department at the Sorbonne. Is that right?" The chief seemed greatly impressed. Ari nodded modestly. "Yes, for the past 5 years. I taught there for almost 17. published lots of articles. You're really way overqualified for anything I can offer you, but we'd like to have you join the staff. I've been thinking for weeks about a new feature, a twice-weekly news analysis column, and wondering who I could get to write it. How would you like to take that on?" "It would be an honor and a challenge," responded Ari enthusiastically. Maybe there was something to live for after all. "That should still leave you time to teach a class or two at the Hebrew University if you're interested," the chief added. "That's a possibility." Ari didn't want to dampen the chief's enthusiasm. But in his heart he knew he was finished with the world of academia. He couldn't bear to be around students and not involve them in that cause to which his entire life had been devoted. And that, of course, was out of the question. He had a whole new life to begin. Ari was hired on the spot. As he signed his contract, he could imagine Yakov's triumphant and predictable pronouncement, "It's a miracle!" So be it, he had a job. True, the starting salary wasn't anything to brag about, but it would pay his half of the rent and utilities, with a little left over for some minimal personal spending and even a small savings. A man starting life all over again at his age couldn't expect much more. At least it was a first step in the right direction that he hoped would eventually see his son in his care. Perhaps fate would begin to smile after all. In the days that followed, the job grew on Ari. He was on his own with no one looking over his shoulder, able to express his personal opinions with only minimal suggestions from the top. After all, it was a new experience for him, and he was thankful for constructive criticism and advice. The other staff were generally congenial, and some of them, especially an attractive young reporter who reminded him somewhat of Nicole, made decidedly friendly overtures. As for Ari, office camaraderie was okay, but nothing more. Not yet. Perhaps the void left in his life by Nicole's death could be filled after all, but it couldn't be rushed. He'd be cautious, slow to establish close friendships, knowing that they could become a minefield of danger. That restrained attitude was a carryover from his years of secret work. It was difficult to shake habits that had been so deeply ingrained. Ari wasn't at all happy with the way events were proceeding in Europe. Let Bush and Gorbachev, and the Pope, take the credit. It was their new world order, not at all what he'd had in mind. He was washing his hands of it all, determined to clean every vestige of the past out of his briefcase and his mind. He carefully burned page after page of names, addresses, and phone numbers. His lieutenants throughout Eastern Europe and Asia must be wondering what had happened. He hadn't even been able to get a message out to them. They were on their own now. One of the blessings of the new job was that Ari could deal with current issues in his column. His third feature was a 3-part, in-depth analysis of the Stasi and its destructive effect upon East German society, not only in its heyday, but the traumatic, continuing repercussions since the wall had come down. Paid informers had been everywhere. No place had been safe, from the schoolroom to the pulpit. Even the Roman Catholic confessional, through hidden microphones and corrupt priests, had been used by the Stasi for its evil work. And now that the truth was coming out at last, friends and families were being torn asunder as they learned that some of their closest and most trusted companions had for years been well paid by the Stasi to inform upon and betray them. Divorce, suicide, and even murder of betrayers in outraged revenge for years spent in prison were the continuing fruit of past decades of treachery. There was another side of the story, too, that Ari also laid out as one of the results of German unification. In the new Germany, ex-Stasi agents who had escaped the accusations of victims were becoming private detectives, a profession unheard of under Marxism, but suddenly in great demand under capitalism. Some of the work involved getting the goods on their old comrades. Freedom came with a heavy price tag. There was a great deal of popular demand among readers for commentary on new trends in Europe, with special interest, of course, in anything related to Israel and worldwide Jewry. With unification, the former East Germany was becoming a breeding ground for hate groups that were growing increasingly powerful and violent. Ari did a 2-part series analyzing the rise of neo-Nazism with special emphasis upon anti-Semitism. The chief was more than pleased with his new recruit, and so were his readers. "I like what you're writing better now than I did a month ago," Yakov told Ari one evening as they were eating supper together at the small table next to the kitchen. "I can see a slow but steady metamorphosis in your thinking." "I must admit," confessed Ari, "that living in Israel has given me an entirely different perspective than I had before. I'm beginning to see things in a new light, though I still have problems with Zionism and the chosen people thing." Yakov's round face lit up with a brighter than usual smile. "You're a fair man, Ari. You respect facts. I like that. You'll come around." "I see the news coming in on the wires and satellite daily, not just from news bureaus, but we pick up raw stuff through our own people out there. It's been an education. Incredible, the outpouring of hatred and threats of extermination against Israel from the surrounding Arab states. Yet the world ignores it. We're the bad guys for wanting to defend ourselves." "I don't think most of the world knows the truth, or maybe even wants to. Most of this stuff never gets off the wires into a form that reaches the average person. They're kept in ignorance." "Those are not idle threats," Yakov reminded him. "They seem to be when nothing comes of them, but that's only because the Arabs have been defeated in each war and the Soviets are reluctant to back them in another. They're hoping to win a propaganda war to establish an independent Palestinian state as a base inside Israel. In the meantime, even while crying peace, they try every possible means of terrorism against us from outside." Ari nodded his agreement. "At first I was critical of the military presence. It's everywhere. Planes overhead, sonic booms, helicopters always on some mission, soldiers in the streets. You really have to be here a while to understand it." "You'll be a real Israeli soon," exulted Yakov with approval. "Not so fast, you old warhorse," laughed Ari. "I'm still concerned about the siege mentality among you Israelis. It could breed a destructive paranoia and extremism. I see some signs of it in the Knesset from time to time, and in some of the political parties that are jockeying for power. That worries me." "And me as well," agreed Yakov. "Really?" Impulsively, Ari reached across the table and shook the old warrior's hand vigorously. David dropped in at the apartment about once a week. He and Yakov seemed to have a genuine friendship that indeed went back for decades. Yet there was something odd about the visits that puzzled Ari. The man was intelligent and knowledgeable, a good talker on almost any subject, but very vague on personal matters. Ari had given him several opportunities to elaborate even slightly on what he did at the Defense Department, but David adroitly sidestepped each one. Ari suspected that David had something to do with Israeli intelligence, and that Yakov's sharing of his apartment was part of a plan to keep their eyes on him. He could understand why the Israelis might want to do that, considering his past, the circumstances under which he'd been sent to them, and the fact that he'd been on the top of the Interpol wanted list for years. So what did it matter? Let them watch him, if that's indeed what they were doing, until they tired of it. They'd soon be convinced that he had nothing to hide. Not anymore. "Ari, my son, my son!" Ari heard himself muttering the words in agony as he struggled into wakefulness early one morning after he'd been in Israel about 6 weeks. Little Ari Paul was on his heart and conscience day and night. How desperately he wanted to bring him to Israel. Yet there were so many practical problems standing in the way. He had no money for what would undoubtedly prove a costly custody battle in the French courts. He couldn't even hire a lawyer to look into it as yet. Moreover, given his present living arrangements and minimal salary, and his past criminal record, he wouldn't seem very well qualified in the eyes of the court. Common sense, however, was overridden by passion. How he longed to see his son, to hold him in his arms, to protect him and care for him. This natural desire was intensified by an overwhelming sense of guilt that continued to torment him. The fact that he had insisted upon an abortion and had refused to take any responsibility for Nikki's pregnancy continued to haunt him. The child was his, and his alone, now that she was gone. He owed it to her, to Nikki, to find their baby and raise him in her memory. There was another consideration that troubled him. and increasing risk was involved the longer his child remained separated from him. What if Roger's group should try to use the baby boy as leverage? They might threaten to kill the child if any information was leaked about them. Certainly it would be insane to contact these old associates, and now antagonists, in attempting to locate his son. Ari remembered that Nicky had come under the influence of a doctor and his wife, a nurse whom she had known at the Paris hospital where she had been doing her residency. She had stayed with them in the process of leaving him and finding an apartment of her own. It would seem likely, then, that they were the ones who had driven her to Orly to see him off. If so, she had left the baby with them when she'd come inside the airport to bid him farewell. At least it was a starting point. They would know something, if they'd tell him. "Of course you're welcome to call Paris or anywhere else," Yakov readily told Ari when he asked about using the phone. "We'll look at the bills when they come in and settle up." It was no problem getting the number from the international operator. Ari quickly dialed the hospital and made his inquiry. There were several married couples who both worked there, but only one doctor-nurse team. Their name was Duclos. It rang a bell immediately. "Dr. Duclos," Ari said when he'd gotten him at last. "My name is Ari Thalberg, formerly known as Professor Hans Müller at the Sorbonne. I was engaged to Nicole. She probably mentioned me. You know of her tragic death." "Yes, I do. We were with her at the time. We brought her to say goodbye to you at Orly." "I thought so," continued Ari hopefully. "Then she must have left our child with you. How is he?" There was a moment's hesitation. "Yes, she did," said Dr. Duclos guardedly. "He's a beautiful, happy baby. He's doing very well with us." "He's my son," Ari blurted out, unable to restrain himself. "Could you send me a picture?" "Certainly. What's your address?" Ari gave him the number and spelled out the street name. "One day, when it's possible, I'd like to have him here with me." This time there was a longer silence on the other end before the doctor replied. "I don't want to deceive you by holding out any hope on that score," he said at last. "You wanted her to abort the baby, I believe. What we may have discussed when she first realized she was pregnant is irrelevant now. Nicky had the baby. I'm the father, and I have a parental interest in my son." "Yes, I'm sure you do," came the placating response. "But there are legal avenues. You weren't married." "We're not discussing moral issues," cut in Ari. "No, of course not. I'm simply telling you the facts. Since you weren't married to Nicole, you'll need to provide some proof." "You know I'm the father. Nicky must have told you." "I'm not the judge. It's a matter for the courts to decide. To be very frank, the mother's wishes will have prior claim. She made arrangements for us to keep the baby and raise him." "Can you prove that in court?" "We already have. Nicole must have had a premonition of her death. She said something about a dream. It was so real to her that, well, she wouldn't leave for the airport until she'd written and signed a simple statement asking us to raise the child in the Christian faith." "That's a violation of his ethnic origin," spluttered Ari, then fell silent in frustration. So it had been a premonition of death. Jerusalem. The name turned to bitter gall. Yakov would call it another miracle, a sign that God was at work. But what kind of a God would rob him of his dearest love and was now keeping him from his son? Almost unheard was the doctor's calm and inexorable logic. "The courts will decide any future guardianship changes. In the meantime, we've been awarded legal custody. As for the child's fate, he'll decide himself when he's old enough. Better just leave it at that, Professor Thalberg. Oh, yes, I'll send those pictures right away." For some time, Ari sat staring at the silent phone. No, he wouldn't fight Duclos. Not yet. At least he knew who had his son. Let them keep him for now. Eventually, he would gain custody. And if they did raise him as a Christian during his impressionable years, it would be simple enough to teach him otherwise when he was older and could think for himself.